But the subject tonight is going to be philosophy and bias in the creation-evolution debate. And really, if you don't understand what I'm going to talk about tonight, you're going to get really, really frustrated when you read the newspaper, when you read Time Magazine, when you see the National Geographic Channel, whatever, Discovery Channel. It's going to be really frustrating because obviously the secular world presents evolution as established fact. But what we need to understand is that that's not the case at all. Now let me open with a verse. It's one of the verses I alluded to this morning to remind you what we want to do with these sessions. 1 Peter 3:15 tells us we're to sanctify the Lord God in our hearts and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks us a reason of the hope that's in us with meekness and fear. So we are always to be prepared to give an answer or a reason for why we believe what we believe. So with that in mind, let me look at the creation-evolution debate and two different philosophies or approaches of entering this debate. We're going to talk about the naturalistic philosophy, and then we're going to look at the creationist philosophy. And we're going to start with the first. Now, most people think, and by the way, some of the material I'm going to present in this, for those of you that are here this morning, there's going to be a lot of overlap between some of the things that I will say and what Skip said this morning. But I'm going to head a little different direction with them at the end than he did. But I think for Skip and I really don't know exactly which slides we have, so there's going to be some overlap probably all week long with some of this, so I apologize. But you know as well as I that most people only retain a small percentage of what they hear anyway, so repetition is always good. The Lord repeated things over and over and over in His teaching ministry. But most people think that the creation-evolution debate is a battle over who has the most evidence. In other words, we as creationists have our evidence, the evolutionists have their evidence, and we're fighting over who has the most. But that is not at all the case because we're talking about the same evidence. There's not two different sets of evidence. There's actually only one set of evidence. We have the same facts. You know, when I go to a natural history museum anywhere in this world and I see a fossil behind the glass case there, I don't disagree with the fossil. The fossil is what it is. I disagree with the placard telling me how old the fossil is, and they think they know everything about it. That's what I disagree with. So we have exactly the same facts. We also use the same science. It's not like the evolutionists use different scientific principles and have different scientific laws than creationists do. It's exactly the same science. The difference is the starting point. We all enter this debate with presuppositions. And the presuppositions that we have will always color our interpretation of the evidence. And that's why we're going to come to different conclusions, even though we're looking at exactly the same evidence. Let me illustrate. Let's assume we dig up this dinosaur fossil. Let's assume someone digs that up who believes in evolution, and he starts with the assumption that evolution is true and the earth is millions of years old. That person will always come up with an interpretation consistent with evolution and an order, and all contrary evidence will be explained away. But I've got to be honest, as a creationist, if I dig up a fossil like that and I start with an assumption of biblical history, I will always come out with an interpretation consistent with the Bible. Another example, let's say we dig up this fossil fish somewhere. There's two possible interpretations for this fossil. Number one, the fish evolved over millions of years. Number two, this fish died in Noah's flood, having descended from originally created fish. So we have the same fossil, but we have two very different interpretations, and the only difference is the starting points. So exactly the same evidence. Now, the naturalistic philosophy says this, and if you've ever attended, and there's not many debates anymore between creationists and evolutionists, there used to be a lot more than there are now, but if you were ever to attend such a debate, I would almost guarantee that at some point the evolutionists would make a statement very similar to this. Something to the effect that evolution is science, but creation is merely religion. How many of you have heard something like that before? Okay, I've heard that on many occasions, and that's a common tactic that they use. But let me ask the question, is that statement true? In order to answer that, we have to define science. So let me ask the question, what exactly is science? I'll give you a couple definitions. The first one comes from the Oxford Dictionary that defines science this way. It's a branch of study which is concerned either with a connected body of demonstrated truths or with observed facts systematically classified and more or less collocated by being brought under general laws, which includes trustworthy methods for the discovery of new truth within its own domain. Notice the focus on demonstrated and observed. A good scientific theory is something that you can demonstrate, you can observe, you can possibly falsify it to show that it's not true. Let me give you another definition, this time from Webster's, which defines science as knowledge covering general truths or the operation of general laws, especially as obtained and tested through scientific method. And really, that last phrase there, tested through scientific method, is the key. Now, most of you remember, going back to your middle school or junior high days or whatever they called it when you were in school, you probably remember the scientific method. You start with your hypothesis, you design experiments to test your hypothesis, you either verify that it's true or you falsify it, and then you can start over with a new hypothesis. That's how science works. That's the scientific method. We probably are all familiar with that. So I'd like to suggest that a very simple 4-word definition of science might be this: the scientific method applied. And I would also like to suggest that under this very narrow definition of science, neither creation nor evolution can technically be considered science. Now, why do I say that? I say that because you can't verify either of them in the laboratory. Whatever happened in the beginning, there's no way you can design a series of experiments to verify that. Furthermore, there were no human observers. Whether creation is true or evolution is true, there were no human observers to what happened in the beginning. Now, we as creationists believe that God was there, and obviously He was an observer, but there were no human observers. So, if you want to be very, very technical and very, very precise with your definition of science, you could say that neither are technically scientific. Matter of fact, let me give you a quote from a couple of honest evolutionists here who admit this. They say, "Our theory of evolution has become, as Popper described, one which cannot be refuted by any possible observations. Every conceivable observation can be fitted into it. It is thus outside of empirical science, but not necessarily false. No one can think of ways to test it. Ideas, either without basis or based on a few laboratory experiments carried out in extremely simplified systems, have attained currency far beyond their validity. They have become part of an evolutionary dogma accepted by most of us as part of our training." So these guys are being honest, and they say we believe evolution is true, but it's not technically science. And not all evolutionists are that honest. Now, let me, as Skip did this morning, talk a little bit about the difference between operational science and what we'll call historical science. Because what we can do is we can broaden our definition of science a little bit to include historical science. And let me distinguish between the two. Operational science, rather, we could define as the use of observable, repeatable experiments in a controlled environment to discover patterns of recurring behavior in the present physical universe. Everyone understands what we're talking about. Operational science is the science that discovers vaccines, that you can use it to build airplanes. It's the normal, everyday science that everyone is familiar with. Historical science is different. Historical science would be the use of reliable eyewitness testimony, if available, and we've already said in this debate there is none of that, or circumstantial evidence to determine the cause or causes of some past, unobservable singular event. You see, when you dig up a fossil, as Skip talked about this morning, that fossil doesn't have exclamations on it telling you how it died or how it got there. So you've got to come up with some sort of a story or an explanation to explain how that fossil got there. Keep in mind that its fossils exist in the present. You dig it up right now, again, it doesn't have a tag on it telling you how old it is. You don't know. So you've got to come up with some sort of explanation that explains how it got there. And that's what we use historical science for. Let me give you a quote from Jerry Coyne, a famous evolutionist who admits this. He said, "Evolutionary biology is a historical science laden with history's inevitable imponderables. We evolutionary biologists cannot generate a Cretaceous park to observe exactly what killed the dinosaurs, And unlike harder scientists, we usually cannot resolve issues with a simple experiment, such as adding tube A to tube B and noting the color of the mixture. So he's honest about that. He says we use historic science, and it's not like operational science. It's different. So therefore, I would say this. If we broaden that definition of science to include historical science, I would argue that both creation and evolution, under that broader definition, could be considered, in a sense, scientific. Why do I say that? Because both are attempts to explain how the evidence that exists in the present got there. They're both doing the same thing, very different explanations, but they're both trying to explain how the evidence got there. Now here's the problem. Everything I've said so far is based on the idea that the definition of science is the scientific method applied. But we have to understand, and this is vital that we understand this, that they've changed the definition of science on us today. I don't know if you realize that or not. It's not like it's been stated publicly that they've done that. But in essence, the definition of science that is used today is naturalism applied. And what that means is everything has to have a purely naturalistic explanation for it to be considered scientific. In other words, forget God. The minute you even suggest the possibility of a designer or a creator of any kind, by definition, they say you have now left the realm of science and you have entered the realm of religion, and therefore we don't even have to consider what you're proposing because it's not even scientific. So they, in essence, win the debate by defining the terms in such a way that they can't lose. And that's what's happened today. The definition of science has changed. Now let me give you a quote from Richard Lewontin, a famous Harvard scientist, who admits this. Now this is a lengthy quote, but follow what this man is saying. He is being honest and sort of giving away what they do. He says this: our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have an a priori commitment, a commitment to materialism. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept the material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Now, there's a lot of lengthy words there, but you understand what he's saying? He's basically saying it's not that the evidence forces us to a purely naturalistic conclusion. It's that we have started out with the presupposition that there can be no supernatural, because after all, we can't allow a divine foot in the door. We can't allow for a God. We can't possibly do that. So it really doesn't matter what we find. We are going to come up with a material explanation for that. And so that's what's happening today. And we need to understand that, or we're going to get very, very frustrated. This all reminds me of what we read about in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, where Peter is prophesying about the last days and what it will be like in the last days. And he says there that in that time they will be willingly ignorant. In other words, it's not a problem with the mind, it's a problem of the will. It's a volitional problem. They're going to be willingly ignorant basically of two things: the creation and the worldwide flood. That by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was being overflowed with water perished. And folks, that's exactly what we see today. It looks like Peter is writing in the 21st century because it's exactly what's happening. They are willingly ignorant of these things and refuse to see them. Let me give you a quote from Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson is part of the intelligent design movement. Well, if you're familiar with them, they're not young earth creationists like I am. They're not even necessarily all Christians. They're not advocating any particular God, but they're a group of scientists who believe there's overwhelming evidence for design in nature. Philip Johnson was actually a Cal Berkeley law professor, and he's written a book called Reason in the Balance. In this section of the book, he's talking about how creationist arguments aren't being allowed to be heard in public school settings or places like that. And he says this: the logic implies that creationist arguments must be excluded regardless of their merits, and the students may hear only the naturalistic viewpoint of the subject of origins. The creationist viewpoint was thoroughly marginalized by being confined within the category of religion. Now, what does it mean to marginalize something? Well, he defines that in his book. He says a viewpoint or a theory is marginalized when, without being refuted, it is categorized in such a way that it can be excluded from serious consideration, and that's exactly what they've done. The minute you suggest a God or designer, they blow their whistle because you stepped out of bounds. And that's exactly what happened. Johnson in his book gives an illustration. He gives this illustration of a detective going to solve a murder mystery. And he goes to this huge building that's got a huge room in the middle of it, and there's a man lying flat as a pancake in the middle of this room, dead. And the detective is there to solve the mystery. And as he's looking for clues, he's investigating. One of the problems he has, there's this elephant in the room that keeps getting in his way. And he has to go around the elephant and all that. And of course, he'll never consider the possibility that the elephant could be the culprit. Why? Because everyone knows what? A detective always gets his what? His man. And if it has to be a man, you can't consider pachyderms, right? So that can't possibly, even though the answer might be staring you in the face, if you've ruled that out from the onset, you will never come to that conclusion. Let me illustrate this also. Several years ago, when I was doing campus ministry at Clemson University, we actually had there was a Christian college nearby, and we had 3 different professors come, and we did sort of a series on this topic, the creation evolution debate. And we actually had a Clemson University biologist show up. His name was Dr. Jim Colosino, and obviously he disagreed with what we were presenting, and he had a lot of questions and so forth. But to his credit, he was a nice guy. And he wasn't belligerent about it like some can be. And we actually developed a friendship of sorts, and even went to lunch a couple times. And we would have these discussions, and neither of us would agree with anything the other one was saying. We'd go back and forth on this, but he was cordial about it. But I will never forget, on one occasion, I asked him a question. I said, Dr. Colosino, let's say hypothetically, there was some scientific discovery that was made that absolutely ruled out the possibility of evolution, beyond a shadow of a doubt. Would you then be willing to consider the possibility of a designer? His answer floored me. He said this, and I quote, "No, because that would be giving up." Now, do you understand what he's saying there? Do you understand what he's saying? To him, to consider the possibility of a designer, he's left science and he's entered the world of make-believe. He's entered the world of the tooth fairy. He's entered the world of Santa Claus, etc. in his mind. And that's the way they think. So it doesn't matter what would be found. He would never consider the possibility of a designer. And so that's what we're fighting against today. And an unfortunate result of this definition of science is that today the creation-evolution debate is no longer fought on the scientific level where it ought to be. It's fought on the philosophical level. And therefore, most public school students, secular college students, etc., never hear all the evidence. And there's incredible implications from the evidence. I think I used this quote this morning in one of the sessions, but Darwin himself says, "A man who has no assured and ever-present belief in the existence of a personal God or of a future existence with retribution and reward can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest or which seems to him to be the best ones." And so there's some incredible implications that are never considered because this is never even discussed, unfortunately. Johnson in his book sort of summarizes, he says this way: the basic defense is to deflect the discussion from the categories of true and false into categories that effectively protect naturalism from critical scrutiny. It's said that naturalism is science, whereas theism belongs to religion. Naturalism is based on reason, whereas theism is based on faith. Naturalism provides knowledge, whereas theism provides only belief. Science, reason, and knowledge easily trump religion, faith, and belief. And that's exactly right. And so far I've basically been trying to argue that I believe creation is at least as scientific as evolution, but I'd also like to argue that evolution is at least as religious as creation. I would like to suggest that evolution is a religious belief system and it must be accepted by faith. Matter of fact, in my opinion, I think it takes a whole lot more faith to believe what they believe than it does to believe what I believe. It's a belief system, it cannot be proved scientifically, and so it's no different in that sense than creation. Here's an honest evolutionist writing in a 1971 introduction to Darwin's Origin of Species. He says the fact of evolution is the backbone of biology, and biology is thus in the peculiar position of being a science founded on an unproved theory. Is it then a science or a faith? Belief in the theory of evolution is thus exactly parallel to belief in special creation. Both are concepts which believers know to be true, but neither up to the present has been capable of proof. Michael Ruse, a famous philosopher, says evolution is promoted by its practitioners as more than mere science. Evolution is promulgated as an ideology, a secular religion, a full-fledged alternative to Christianity with meaning and morality. You may be familiar with the Humanist Manifesto. The Supreme Court has recognized humanism as a religion, and the first two tenets, as stated there, I won't take the time to read them, have to do with evolution. So there are incredible religious implications from the theory of evolution. The New Age movement is another religious system that's on top of that evolutionary foundation. So there are incredible religious implications from evolution, just like there are from creation. Therefore, let me define, I like Ken Ham's definition of evolution. And he defines evolution this way. He says evolution can be defined as a belief about the past, based on the words of scientists who don't know everything, who were not there, and who are trying to explain how the evidence which only exists in the present got there. And I think that's a very good definition of evolution. So my conclusion is that creation is at least as scientific as evolution, and evolution is at least as religious as creation. So therefore, it's not a matter of bias. You know, we, as Christians, are always accused of being biased. When we talk to an evolutionist about, you guys are biased because you're Christians, and therefore we can't discuss this. And my response is, it's not a matter of bias. It's a matter of which bias is the best bias to be biased with. That's what we're arguing about, because all of us have bias. Everyone enters this debate with bias. There's no one that comes into the debate with a blank mind. Everyone has bias. It's just that I admit mine. They don't tend to admit theirs. And so that's, again, the conclusion is we're all battling over the same evidence. Now, let me contrast all that naturalistic philosophy that basically, by definition, rules out creation from the start by definition, with the creationist philosophy, which says the creation model and the evolution model should be compared scientifically, not philosophically, but scientifically, to determine which offers the best explanation about the past and explains the evidence of the present. And so the evolution model says this: about 15 billion years ago, the universe exploded into existence. About 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth evolved. About 3.5 billion years ago, life evolved on Earth. Humans evolved from ape-like creatures, and so the key is time, chance, and natural processes. Now contrast that with a biblical creation model which says God created the universe and everything in it in 6 days. Sin was the cause of death. We looked at this morning for some of you that were here. God destroyed the world by a worldwide flood. Man was created in the image of God, and therefore God created all things. Now what you can do is you can take both of those models and you can make predictions based on those models. In other words, if this model is true, this is what we ought to be able to see in the world today. So you take the evolutionary model, and if it is indeed true, you would predict that we would see transitional forms, for instance, in the fossil record. All right, things changing from one kind to another kind. You would expect to see beneficial mutations that actually add information to the genome of different creatures. You would expect things getting better or an increase in organized complexity from generation to generation over time. And you would expect, finally, new species. As you go up that, you've all seen pictures of that evolutionary tree. And as you branch out farther and farther, you'd expect to see more and more species all the time. In other words, innovation and integration. However, if the creation model is true, we expect to see separate, distinct times in the fossil record and in life. We expect to see evidence for intelligent design in nature. We expect to see a tendency for decay, or in other words, a decrease in organized complexity over time. And we'd also expect to see extinction of species, in other words, conservation disintegration. So I want to suggest this, and really all the sessions that we're doing today and tomorrow can be summarized by this slide right here. What we're trying to show is what we see in God's world agrees with what we read in God's Word. And I'm convinced the more I study this topic, I'm more and more convinced all the time that the world, as we examine it, verifies beautifully what we read in the Word of God. And so what we can do, you say, how do we, where do we start with this? Well, I'm suggesting that what we can do is we can take the claims of evolution, we can take the claims of the Bible. Again, you can't prove either with the scientific method, we just talked about that, but what you can do is look at the evidence that exists in the present and try to determine which model best accounts for the evidence that exists in the present. Both of the models offer their stories of how the evidence got here. But let's look at the two models, which of them best accounts for the evidence that we see in the present. And what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is give you 3 or 4 examples. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in any one area of science, but I want to give you 3 or 4 examples of how you could take these 2 different models and see which model best accounts for the evidence that we have in the present. Let's take, for instance, the fossil record. Now, Skip talked about fossils this morning, but he took it a little bit different direction. He talked more about how fossils formed and where they came from and things like that. I want to talk just for a second about the so-called missing links, which I think are really missing in the fossil record. The late Stephen Jay Gould, who probably when he was alive was maybe the world's most famous evolutionist, he said all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt. He also said the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. So basically he's saying there are all kinds of gaps, there's missing links in the fossil record. These transitionary fossils between different kinds, they simply aren't there. And one of the biggest gaps of all is what we call the Cambrian explosion of life. Let me give you a quote from another evolutionist. He says, "There is no question that such gaps exist. A big gap appears at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion over 500 million years ago, when great numbers of new species suddenly appeared in the fossil record." Now this is your typical geologic time chart that you will see in a lot of standard textbooks. And of course, as a creationist, I do not accept these ages. These are their ages. And as Skip mentioned this morning, these layers don't always appear in this order, and the vast majority of the land surface on the Earth has 5 or fewer of these anyway, so you can't always dig down and find these just like this. But nonetheless, the Cambrian are down here at the basement. These are all sedimentary rocks, by definition laid down by moving water. The Cambrian is down here at the very bottom. All right, in their theory, 544 to 505 million years ago. Now, if evolution is true, and in the Cambrian rocks, by the way, we find evidence of single-cell organisms. And what you'd expect to find evidence of from that 2-celled organisms, 4-celled organisms, 8-celled organisms, et cetera, et cetera. You see what I'm saying? This transition from those to more complex life. If the Darwinian model is true, that's what you expect to find. But that's not what we find. What we find is seemingly out of nowhere, with no traces whatsoever of any ancestors, these very complex invertebrate creatures seemingly just exploding out of nowhere. Things like trilobites and sponges and jellyfish, very complex creatures, and no evidence whatsoever for any intermediates between single-cell organisms and those. And the question is, where in the world are all the intermediates? And thus it's called the Cambrian explosion. Let me give you another quote here. The Cambrian explosion is not just a case of all the major animal phyla appearing at about the same place in the geologic column. It's also a situation of no ancestors to suggest how they may have evolved. So where are the thousands of intermediates? And it's not just here at the bottom. As you go up this evolutionary tree of life, we would expect to see intermediate links all the way up, but we don't. They're missing. I know you can't read these quotations, but this is actually from a little tract that Answers in Genesis published a few years ago. And all these quotes are not from creationists, they're from evolutionists. And these evolutionists are admitting that the links between, let's say, fish and amphibians and reptiles, etc., they're missing. They're just not there. Now, that's not to say that there are no fossils whatsoever that evolutionists point to as missing links. There are indeed a handful, but there are only a few. There ought to be thousands and thousands and thousands, and furthermore, there's not a single one that all of them agree on. And so there's a handful of these, there's some Archaeopteryx and some others, but there ought to be thousands and thousands of them. And so what a lot of evolutionists do, they see this evidence, and some evolutionists, it was Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge that came up with what they call the punctuated equilibrium theory, which actually states that evolution happens in spurts. There's long periods of time where absolutely millions of years where nothing happens. It just sort of stays the same, and there's these short spurts of activity where all this evolution takes place, and therefore we wouldn't expect to find these missing links in the fossil record. Now, that's one possible way to interpret that evidence. You can do that. That's an interpretation. But my question is, which is the better model? If you're constantly having to change your model with what we call rescue devices, then at some point you may question, is my model really a good model? And so I would like to argue that the creation model much better accounts for the fossil record. I'm going to move on. And I would like to argue that evolution, like creation, is a matter of faith. Let me move from paleontology to geology for a minute and talk about something like the Grand Canyon. There's really two possible explanations for the Grand Canyon. Very simply, a lot of time and a little bit of water. In other words, that Colorado River acting over millions and millions and millions of years, as some of those layers were uplifted, the Colorado River carved out that canyon over millions and millions of years. Of course, that's the traditional explanation of the Grand Canyon, but the other explanation is a lot of water and a little bit of time. Most creationists believe that there was a series of lakes in the western United States to the east of what is now the Grand Canyon area. And there's good evidence that a dam was breached. The sediments were still soft. There was just tons of water came pouring through there and carved out that canyon in a very short amount of time. So we have two very different explanations for the same evidence. If you look at the Grand Canyon from a secular perspective, all right, you're going to come up with millions of years. All right, that's inevitably going to happen. But if we put on our biblical reality glasses and we look at that same canyon, but look at it from the perspective of the Bible, all right, and we can look at the canyon and we can conclude some things. It contains dead things. There's all kinds of fossils in those layers. We know from the Bible, we talked about this morning, that death came before or after sin. After sin. So biblically, the chronology had to happen after sin. We can assume the layers were formed in Noah's flood. By the way, if there really were a worldwide flood, as described in Genesis chapter 6 through 9, with all the volcanic activity and all the earthquake activity and everything else going on, what would you expect the evidence to be for such a worldwide flood? Well, as Ken Ham famously said, you'd expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Well, what is it we actually find? Well, we find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. That's what we find. That's exactly what we'd expect to find if the worldwide flood really occurred. So the question becomes, was the canyon carved by time or by catastrophe? Something happened in 1980 that can help us with that. And of course, if some of you are familiar with the eruption of Mount St. Helen, I can remember that. I was 14 years old, and that, of course, was a huge deal because there had not been a volcano erupt in the continental 48 since I don't know when. And so that was a huge thing. Geologists knew it was going to happen. They were there to observe it. And so it was a big, big thing. But that volcano, and by the way, it didn't erupt up. It erupted out to the north. And it kind of exploded out to the north. And it just devastated the landscape around there and just totally changed the landscape around the area of Mount St. Helens. One of the things that came about as a result is what they call the Little Grand Canyon of the Toutle River. It's about a 1/4 in scale model of the Grand Canyon. And if you look at that canyon and you did not know what happened, you can see some of the pictures there, you would probably assume that took a long, long time before. But that's not the case at all. It was carved very, very, very rapidly. There was volcanic ash, there was lava flows and things like that, and carved that very, very rapidly. Matter of fact, look at some of the layering you can see right here, there's a man down here for scale, and also there's a picture of that. And notice some of the fine layer even right there. And by the way, one of the things that, for instance, moving water does very, very, very effectively is it sorts out things based on size and density and deposits them accordingly so that it creates layers. Right? That's what moving water does. And so again, a geologist that didn't know what happened, they look at these layers and say, well, that represents millions of years of time. And we know it happened very, very rapidly. So I would suggest if you look at the evidence of the Grand Canyon, based on observational science, it's better explained by the creation model than the evolutionary model. And I realize that we're talking geology there, not biology. But by the way, it doesn't take a lot of time to turn something into a fossil or to petrify something. Here's an example of solid rock inside a man-made pipe. Just like Skip said this morning, all it takes is the right what? Right conditions. It doesn't take a lot of time. Or a petrified water wheel. Does anyone think that thing sat there for millions of years? Well, it got petrified. Or stalactites and stalagmites. I'm so tired of going on these tours in caves or coal mines or whatever and being told that this stuff takes millions of years to form. No, it doesn't. It just takes the right conditions. Again, this guy has watched through photo monitoring a stalactite grow several inches in a matter of days. Or here you have a bat covered up by stalagmite material. Does anybody think that thing sat there for millions of years without rotting and was being covered up by this stuff? That obviously happened very, very rapidly. And not only that, a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the dinosaur bones they find today are not completely fossilized. Phil Curry, famous paleontologist, admits here that fossilization can happen very rapidly under the right conditions. I'm going fast for the sake of time, but here's a quote from him also. Bones do not have to be turned into stone to be fossils, and usually most of the original bone is still present in the dinosaur fossil. Here's another quote from the same individual there, speaking of some of the dinosaur bones he's found up in Canada. They're as light as balsa wood and look as fresh as yesterday's dog bones. And another fascinating discovery in recent times, and Skip may talk more about this when he talks about dinosaurs, probably will, so maybe I'm stealing a little bit of his thunder, but that's okay. But one of the fascinating finds that they found recently is soft tissue and proteins and even red blood cells in dinosaur bones in recent years. As a matter of fact, Dr. Mary Schweitzer, who works right here at North Carolina State University, was actually the key individual in discovering this. As a matter of fact, she has in essence created a new field of science, molecular paleontology, because before that time, no one would ever have dreamed of looking inside a 65 million year old bone to see if you could still find evidence for soft material or red blood cells or proteins or things like that, because the assumption was it just wasn't there. But she's describing what happened. She's got a T-Rex bone, glowed amber beneath the lens of my microscope. Blood vessels channels snake through a bone matrix in tiny chambers known as leucinae, which house bone-forming cells appear as small ovals. Then a colleague took one look at them and said, you've got red blood cells, you've got red blood cells. And here's a picture. And by the way, there's been she's published several articles. This one is in Science Magazine 2005, and showing pictures of what they actually found. And before this discovery, there's no one on Earth that would have thought that soft tissue could last more than a few thousand years at the absolute most. Here's some more pictures of the red blood cells and the blood vessels. Here's a quote. This author is saying Schweitzer showed two microscope-generated photographs side by side. One of these cells is 65 million years old, and one is about 9 months old. Can anyone tell which is which? And so basically, you could not tell the difference. And here's a quote from Dr. Schweitzer on a website, BioLogos. This was really an old Earth creationist website. But she says that leaves us with two alternatives for interpretation. Either the dinosaurs weren't as old as we think they are, or maybe we don't know exactly how these things get preserved. And I agree 100% with that quotation. Now, the problem, though, is now Mary Schweitzer does not believe these things are young. She believes they're still 65 million years old. Now, this is interesting because Mary Schweitzer claims to be a Christian. I have no reason to doubt that. Matter of fact, I emailed her recently and she actually gave me a gracious response. All right, and I want to give her credit for that. I'm also going to give her credit. She's done some very good science. because she's published in an area where no one thought that this could be true, and yet she was willing to still publish in that area. But the difference between me and her, and she basically admitted that she already believes that there's other evidence that shows the bones have to be old, and therefore she's not really looking for evidence for the first possibility that the bones aren't that old. She's focusing on trying to figure out how they could last that long. What are some possible preservation mechanisms that could allow them to last that long? And that's what she's looking for. All right. Now, obviously, I would disagree with that. Let me give you another quote. This is not from Schweitzer, but this is from a website that is an evolutionary website. It says the appearance of soft tissues, hard tissue or no tissue, has no bearing in the age of the material, organic or inorganic. What is the basis for these determinations is the independent, I totally disagree with that word, existence of geochemical clocks known as radiometric dating. It does not matter what the bones look like or what's in them. If creationists want to dispute the age of the fossil or the earth or the universe, they cannot use the presence or absence of organic tissue among their evidences. And my question is, why not? See, here's the point. It does not matter what discovery we make. If your mind's already made up, it doesn't matter. This word here, I totally reject that idea. What they're trying to say is that some of these dating methods, like the radiometric dating methods, supposedly independently verify that the Earth is millions of years old. And that is blatantly not true. Those dating methods are fraught with assumptions. They assume things like the amount of daughter element in the rock they're dating. They assume the decay rate has never changed. They assume there's never been any parent or daughter material added to that rock over the history. You know what you do when you take rocks from modern volcanic flows and you date them through some of these methods, potassium argon or whatever? You come up with ancient ages. For instance, Mount St. Helens lava dome, there was a rock from a lava flow that was sent to a lab, and they got dates ranging from, I forget what it is, up to 2.8 million years for a volcano that erupted in 1980. So you know these methods don't work. They're fraught with assumptions. As a matter of fact, the whole geologic time scale was established before they even had the science associated with these dating methods. And so my point is, every one of the dating methods starts with the assumption that evolution has happened already. There are no independent dating methods. And so that's where my disagreement lies. Schweitzer said it was exactly like looking at the slice of modern bone, but of course I couldn't believe it. I said to the lab technician, these bones, after all, are 65 million years old. How could red blood cells survive that long? And again, I respectfully ask the question, how do you know they're 65 million years old? See, she starts with that presupposition. That's the problem. I'm going to skip that for the sake of time. Here's another individual that actually wrote Mary Schweitzer. He said, I had one reviewer tell me that he didn't care what the data said. He knew that what I was finding wasn't possible, says Schweitzer. I wrote back and said, well, what data would convince you? And he said, none. See, that's the point. That's the point. Marcus Ross actually is a creationist, but since this initial discovery, his point here is there's been more and more. What people are now doing is looking more and more inside other bones, and they're finding more and more evidence of proteins and soft cell material and things like that. He says it's mounting evidence comes from a wide range of types of different fossils, from the so-called age of dinosaurs, the Tyrannosaurus rex, a Triceratops, a duck-billed dinosaur, even dinosaur eggs. So the bottom line is this. Before these discoveries, no one would have assumed that this type of material could last for any more than, say, a maximum of 10,000 years. So you got two possibilities. One possibility is maybe there's some mechanism that allows the preservation of this stuff longer than we thought. Okay, the other possibility is, well, maybe the bones aren't as old as they say. So again, both models can modify their models as it were to account for the evidence. But my question is, which model best explains the evidence? I'm going to give one more and we'll stop. Carbon dating is supposedly good for only things that are about 50,000 years old or less. Or anything older than that, you're probably not going to get a carbon date. It can be used to date things that were once alive, bones or wood or things like that. What's interesting, in modern times, they begin to date things like dinosaur bones, coal. Coal consistently gives evidence of carbon-14 still there. What happens, carbon-14 decays over time. I think back in the nitrogen 14, I forget, but then carbon 12 is the other stable variety of carbon. You can measure the ratio of carbon 14 to carbon 12, but anything over 50,000 years old, there should be no detectable traces of carbon 14, but yet you find it in coal and even in diamonds. In this example, they carbon dated diamonds and got a carbon age. And a diamond is the hardest substance known on Earth. I can't even conceive the possibility of contamination in a diamond. And I have no idea how the evolutionists can account for that. So again, which model best explains the evidence that exists in the present? Now let me close my part with this. If I tell you only part of the evidence and you believe it, you've not been taught, you've been indoctrinated. But if I tell you all the evidence and you make a decision, you've been taught. Now for the sake of time, I'm going to move past this and again just give credit where credit is due. Most of my slides come from Enters in Genesis.